7 words. That's all it took to start unraveling 3 years of calculated destruction. I was sitting on bed 14 in the Harlan Community Shelter, a converted warehouse on Mill Street with 20 cots, one shared bathroom, and fluorescent lights that buzzed all night. When a woman I had never met sat down in the folding chair beside me, set a brown leather briefcase on the mattress between us, and said, "Your grandmother hired me to find you." I looked at the briefcase. There, in faded black ink on the leather, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. For Caroline, when she's ready. My grandmother had been dead for 5 years. Let me tell you what had happened in the 3 years between her death and that morning. My name is Wren Calloway. I am 28 years old. I have never been arrested. I have never stolen anything. I have never had so much as a parking ticket. I graduated at the top of my high school class. I am organized, reliable, and capable of showing up on time to things, which I know because I had to prove it over and over again for 3 years before anyone would give me the chance. For 3 of those years, my parents called every single employer I applied to and told them I had a felony record. They disguised their voices. They sent fake documents formatted to look like official police reports. They identified themselves as concerned neighbors, social workers, family friends. They tracked every application I submitted and reached out to the employer within 48 hours before the interview could happen, before I could speak for myself. By the time I was 27, I was living in a shelter, eating one meal a day, washing my hair in a gas station bathroom sink because I could not get a job. Not because I was unqualified, because my own parents had made it their project to ensure I stayed unemployable, stayed desperate, stayed small enough to come home. My father texted me once a week during those years, always the same message. Come home and apologize and maybe I'll stop. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I take you back to where this started. Before the shelter, before the briefcase, before the private investigator and the trust fund and the lawsuit and the day a process server walked up my father's driveway while our neighbor was watering her azaleas. I want you to sit with, come home and apologize and maybe I'll stop. That was not a father trying to protect his daughter. That was a man who understood exactly what he was doing and considered it leverage. Here's where it started. A Tuesday morning at the Harlan Public Library. A sticky keyboard. A 15-minute time limit. And the first thing that had felt like hope in a very long time. But before I take you back to that morning, I want to tell you something about the shape of the 3 years that came before the briefcase. Not the dramatic moments. Those are coming, and they are worse than you are probably imagining. I want to tell you about the texture of it. The particular quality of being systematically made to fail by people who know you well enough to do it precisely. Every time I applied for a job, they called within 48 hours. They knew my patterns. They knew which towns I was willing to drive to, which industries I had experience in, which types of positions I was qualified for. They knew all of this because they had spent 25 years watching me, and because my mother had been tracking every application in a small blue notebook with red check marks in the right-hand column. The calls were designed to be untraceable and unverifiable. A concerned neighbor, a family friend, a social worker. Voices slightly disguised. Nothing that could be proven. Just a cloud of suspicion hanging over every application I submitted, a poisoned well I couldn't see or test or clean. And when the phone calls were no longer enough, my father, who had spent 19 years writing memos and formatting official company documents, started sending emails, anonymous addresses, attachments formatted to resemble police reports, close enough to official that a busy manager wouldn't look twice, far enough from real that no actual background check would have produced them. 3 years, 37 calls, 5 fabricated documents, 1 notebook with red check marks, and every week a text. Come home and apologize and maybe I'll stop. That is the full picture of what I was navigating. That is the context in which a library computer with a 15-minute time limit and a sticky keyboard felt like a lifeline. Before I go any further, if you're here, thank you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one and it means more than I can say. Harlan, Ohio. Population just over 4,000. 1 grocery store, 1 high school, 1 diner that had been serving the same meatloaf since 1987. The kind of town where everyone waves from their porch and knows whose truck is parked where it shouldn't be. The Calloway family, that's us, were considered decent people. My father, Roy, worked as a plant manager for 19 years before the facility shut down. My mother, Sandra, volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving. On paper, we were the family other people pointed to approvingly. Behind the front door, things ran on a different set of rules. I didn't have my own house key until I was 20. I wasn't permitted to drive more than 10 miles without calling ahead. When I was 14 and started bussing tables at the Route 30 diner after school, my paychecks went directly into a joint account my mother had opened for safekeeping. I never saw a statement. I never asked. That was simply how things worked, and I had been inside the system long enough that I had stopped noticing the edges of it. I graduated valedictorian. My guidance counselor pulled me aside senior year and said I could get real scholarships. I brought the brochures home. My father didn't open them. He set them on the counter and said, college was for people who couldn't work with their hands. So I stayed. I cleaned, I cooked, I mowed the lawn and helped with the garden and listened to my father talk about how the world was deteriorating every night at dinner. At the end of every meal, he would look at me across the table and say, "You've got a roof, food, and family. What else does a girl your age need?" For a long time, I didn't have an answer. The week after I turned 25, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no fight, no breaking point, no argument that finally crossed a line. I was standing in the kitchen scrubbing the same cast iron skillet I had been scrubbing since I was 12, and a thought arrived in my head with the force and clarity of something dropped from a height. I'm going to be 40 years old standing in this exact spot, doing this exact thing. That thought scared me more than anything my father had ever said. The next morning, I walked to the library, sat down at one of the public computers in the back row, and created a new email address. Not the family one my mother monitored. A new one, just mine. I found a listing for a hardware store in Millfield, 20 minutes east. Full-time, benefits after 90 days. I typed up my application with 2 fingers and hit send before I could second-guess it. 2 days later, they wanted to interview me. Thursday at 10. I read that email 3 times. Then I closed the browser and walked home with my hands shaking. Not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in years. Something that might have been hope. That night at dinner, something was off. My father sat with his fork and his newspaper. He looked at me once with an expression I couldn't name. My mother stood at the sink washing dishes that were already clean. Nobody spoke. The next morning, I drove to Millfield for the interview. The manager shook my hand at the door. He smiled. Then he sat me down and the smile disappeared. His name was Bill, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain. My application was on the desk between us. He said he was going to be straight with me. He said he had received a phone call the previous afternoon. Someone had mentioned a felony theft charge. The room tilted. I gripped the armrest and told him it wasn't true. That I had never been arrested, never stolen anything in my life. He looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize over the next 3 years. The expression of a person who wanted to believe me but had a business to run and a phone call sitting in his ear. "I'm sorry," he said. "We can't move forward." I drove home in silence. No radio, no crying. Just the white lines on Route 30 blurring past. When I pulled into the driveway, my father was on the porch with his newspaper. He didn't look up. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I stood there with my keys in my hand, staring at the back of the newspaper. "Fine," I said. "Good. Your mom made pot roast." I sat through dinner. Pot roast, green beans, iced tea. My mother talked about the neighbor's new fence. My father nodded along like it was the most fascinating thing he'd heard in years. And somewhere between the pot roast and the iced tea, a thought formed. Small and ugly and impossible. Did they know? I pushed it down. They were my parents. Parents don't do that. I would not be able to push it down much longer. Over the next 6 weeks, I applied to 3 more places: a grocery store in another town, a warehouse on the county line, a diner that was hiring mornings. All 3 called me in for interviews. All 3 canceled within 48 hours. The grocery store said the position had been filled. The warehouse never called back. But the diner owner, a woman named Pat, was honest with me. She leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. She said someone had called about me. Said I had a criminal record. Theft and fraud. She said it was a woman identifying herself as a concerned neighbor. That night I waited until my parents went to bed. I crept to my mother's sewing room, the one room that was entirely hers. I opened the desk drawer, pushed aside the fabric scraps and pincushions, and found a small blue notebook. I opened it. My mother's handwriting. Careful. Neat. The same cursive she used for birthday cards. Down the left column, every employer I had applied to. Down the right column, red check marks. Every single one. Checked off one by one. I stood in that dark room with the notebook in my hands and the floor dropped out from under me. This was not paranoia. This was not coincidence. My mother had a list. She was tracking my applications and making calls before the interviews could happen. My family was not trying to protect me. They were systematically ensuring I could not survive without them. I put the notebook back, closed the drawer, and walked to my room. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, turning one question over and over. How do you fight the people who are supposed to protect you? The next morning, I put the notebook on the kitchen table. The tears came before the explanations did. My mother's hand stopped mid-pour and coffee spread across the counter, and she said I had gone through her private things, that this was not how she had raised me. My father set down his toast. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He said they were protecting me, that I had no idea what could happen to a girl alone out there, that I couldn't even cook for myself. I told him I had cooked every meal in the house since I was 16. He told me to drop it. That if I called the police, they would laugh me out of the station. What law had been broken after all? Someone made some phone calls. I want to pause here and tell you what that sentence felt like, because I think it matters. He was technically correct. In the state of Ohio, making a phone call is not, on its face, a crime. What he had done occupied a legal gray area that took a civil attorney 3 months to assemble a case around. In the moment, standing in that kitchen with coffee pooling on the counter and my mother's tears running in precisely timed streams, the technical correctness of his defense was its own kind of violence. He had designed the operation to be unprovable. He had designed it to make me feel crazy for naming it. He had made 37 phone calls and sent 5 forged documents and kept a physical notebook tracking every application I submitted. And he stood in his kitchen buttering toast and told me calmly that there was nothing to report. That calm was the thing that finally made me understand how long this had been planned. This was not a father who had lost his temper. This was a man who had constructed a system and was confident in it. I looked at my mother, tears running down her face, coffee still pooling on the counter. I looked at my father, calm as Sunday morning, already reaching for his second piece of toast. I said, "If you don't stop, I'm leaving." He said, "You walk out that door with nothing. No money, no papers, nothing." I thought he was bluffing. He was not. I packed that night. 1 backpack, 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a phone charger, and a photograph of my grandmother from my nightstand. When I opened the front door, my mother was standing in the hallway. She said if I left, I was dead to them. My father stood behind her, filling the hallway like a wall, not saying a word, not needing to. I stepped onto the porch and opened my banking app. Balance. 0. Years of paychecks, tip money from the diner, birthday cash from Grandma Nora, every dollar I had ever earned, gone. My mother had been on the account since I was 16. She had not needed my permission to take it. I asked for my birth certificate and social security card. Those belong to this house, my father said from behind the screen door. And then he closed it. I walked down the driveway at 9:47 p.m. I had a backpack, a phone at 11% battery, and $12 in my back pocket. No ID, no plan, nowhere to go. For the first time in 25 years, nobody was telling me where to be. It felt like being dropped from a great height and not yet knowing whether the ground was close. I found the Harlan Community Shelter 2 days later through a woman at the gas station counter. The same one who had looked away from me on my first night sitting outside on the curb under the fluorescent lights. She slid an address written on a napkin across the counter without asking questions. I have thought about that woman many times since. 10 seconds of quiet decency from a stranger who owed me nothing, who did not ask why I was there or what had happened or whether it was my fault. She just wrote down the address and slid it over. That is more than most people do. The shelter was a converted warehouse on Mill Street. 20 beds, a shared bathroom, and a kitchen run by volunteers. It smelled like industrial cleaner and reheated soup and the specific exhaustion of people who were in the process of starting over. The fluorescent lights buzzed all night. A woman named Linda Marsh ran the place. 47, short hair, reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. She did not ask me why I was there. She handed me a towel and pointed to bed 14. She said, "You don't have to explain yourself. You just have to want to get back up." I was the youngest person in the shelter by at least 15 years. Most of the others were men in their 50s and 60s, weathered by things they didn't discuss over the communal dinner table. We were all from different roads that had ended at the same place. We nodded at each other in the mornings and passed the salt without ceremony and did not ask questions. That suited me fine. I had run out of answers. I started the process of replacing my documents. Filed for a replacement birth certificate through the mail. 6 to 8 weeks, they said. Went to the DMV for a temporary ID. But without my social security card or supporting documents, I got shuffled into a backlog and told to come back in 3 weeks, and then 3 weeks after that. And then once more after that. I made each trip on the county bus, which ran twice a day and did not run on Sundays. I sat in plastic chairs and filled out forms and was told I needed documents I did not have in order to get the documents I needed. The circularity of it was its own kind of trap, and I recognized it immediately. It was the same architecture my father had been building my whole life. A system of requirements designed to keep you inside itself. While I waited for the documents, I washed dishes at the shelter in exchange for an extra meal. I swept the floors. I organized the supply closet because nobody had organized it in years, and the disorder made me feel worse than the fluorescent lights. Linda noticed. She said, "You don't have to do all that." I said I needed to be moving. She understood. I kept applying for jobs. Farther out this time. 30 miles, 40. Places my parents had never been and names they might not recognize. I told myself distance would fix it. That if I went far enough, their reach would end. I was wrong about that. The restaurant was 35 miles south in a town called Granton. Family place, checkered tablecloths, specials on a whiteboard. They needed a hostess. I got an interview the same week I applied. I borrowed a blouse from another shelter resident, took the county bus at 6 in the morning, and sat across from a manager named Dave who seemed decent, and shook my hand and said he'd let me know by Friday. Thursday morning, Dave called. He said they had decided to go in a different direction. I asked why. He paused. A long pause, the kind that holds something uncomfortable in it. Someone had emailed them a document, he said. It looked like a police report. I sat down on my shelter mattress. Not a phone call this time. An email with an attachment. Formatted, official-looking, sent from an anonymous address to a restaurant 35 miles away. My father had spent 19 years as a plant manager. He knew how to write memos. He knew how to format official-looking paperwork. He had a printer, a scanner, and company letterhead from his former job that looked close enough to something authoritative if you didn't look carefully. The phone calls were not enough anymore. They had upgraded to fabricated documents. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Still cold out there? Doors still open for now? I stared at that message for a long time. Then I deleted it. But my hand was shaking. My father called on a Sunday afternoon. I do not know why I picked up. Maybe because it was raining and the shelter roof leaked over bed 12 and I was tired in a way sleep does not fix. He said to come home. I told him to stop calling my employers. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I told him I had seen the notebook, the one with the check marks. He said I was confused. He said I had always been confused. He said I was unemployable because I wasn't ready for the real world, and that was what he had been trying to explain. I told him I was hanging up. He said if I hung up, I was losing my family. I told him I had already lost it. I pressed the red button. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of keeping my voice level for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. I did not call back. He did not call again. From that point forward, it was only texts. Once a week, sometimes twice. Always the same measured tone. A door held open just enough to remind me it could close. Thanksgiving's coming. Your mom's making pie. Saw your friend Katie at the store. Getting cold. Shelter can't be warm. Each one designed as a hook. Each one designed to make me feel like the problem was mine to solve. Like I was the one who had broken something and needed to come back and repair it. I saved every text. I didn't know yet what I would do with them. But something in me said, keep everything. That turned out to be the smartest thing I did that entire year. Linda told me, one afternoon when I was restocking the supply closet, that she had gotten a call. A woman identifying herself as a social worker had said I had a documented history of violence and posed a risk to other residents. Linda had worked the shelter for 11 years. She knew that was not how social workers operated. She had documented the call. But she was honest with me. If a formal complaint went through the county office, her hands would be tied. My parents had sabotaged my job applications. They had fabricated police reports. They had drained my bank account and kept my identity documents. And now they were trying to take away the last place I could sleep. Something shifted in me when Linda told me that. Not anger. Anger is hot and burns out. This was different. Clear. Like a window that had been smeared with grease for years and someone had finally wiped it clean. I was done being scared. I was ready to be precise. If this is landing somewhere real, if you've ever been the person your family targets instead of supports, subscribe and leave me a comment. It means more than I can explain. There was a business card in Linda's back pocket that she had been holding for me for a month. Ruth Kaplan, licensed private investigator, state of Ohio. License number on the front, no personal cell, just the office line and an address in Millfield. Linda had kept it because the woman who left it had knocked on the front door instead of calling. And Linda had learned in 11 years of running a shelter that people who knock on front doors are a different category of person from people who work from the shadows. My parents worked from the shadows. Anonymous phone calls, untraceable email addresses, documents formatted to look official but never quite identical to the real thing. They never knocked. They sent things from a safe distance and waited to see what fell. That was their method. It had always been their method. I carried that business card in my pocket for 3 weeks before I called. I called on a night when the shelter roof was leaking over bed 12 and the man 2 cots down had been coughing since midnight, and I was lying awake thinking about my grandmother, Nora Calloway. She had lived on a small farm outside of Ridgeway, about 40 minutes from Harland. Chickens, a half-acre garden, a barn she repainted white every spring because she said it kept things honest. She used to say that about a lot of things. It keeps things honest. It was her phrase for whatever she thought was being neglected. She had sold the farm 3 years before she died. I was 23 when she passed. Heart failure, quick, the way she would have wanted. At the funeral, my father cried exactly once during the eulogy, and then went back to shaking hands and accepting casseroles. He had never gotten along with her, not really. She was too direct. She asked questions he didn't want to answer. She was the one person in the family who had never once looked at the way he ran things and decided it was normal. The last time I saw her alone was maybe a year before she died. She had invited me to the farm. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, and she still had access. We sat on the porch with sweet tea, and she said something I did not understand at the time. She said, "If things ever get real bad, someone will come find you. Don't be scared when they do." I laughed. I asked what she was talking about. She did not laugh. She looked out at the field she had worked for 30 years, the field she had just sold. and said, "I know my son, sweetheart. I've known him for 50 years. Then she changed the subject and asked whether the tomatoes were coming in at home. But at the gate, as I was leaving, she said one more thing. I sold the farm, but I didn't spend the money. Remember that? I had not remembered it. Not until month 5 at the shelter, lying on bed 14, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that was shaped, if you looked at it wrong, like the state of Ohio. And then I remembered every word, every syllable. The way she had said it at the gate, as a footnote, almost offhand. The way you say something you need to have said and have been waiting for the right moment to say it. I called Ruth Kaplan the night the roof leaked. She came the next morning at 8, sharp, and Linda let her in. Ruth was exactly as Linda had described. Mid-50s, short gray hair, no jewelry, no nonsense, plain navy jacket, and the brown leather briefcase, old, worn at the corners, clearly handled many times over many years. She sat in the folding chair beside my bed in the mostly empty shelter and set the briefcase between us. On the leather, in faded black ink, in handwriting I had recognized the moment I saw it. For Wren, when she's ready. My grandmother had been dead for 5 years. I had not seen that handwriting in 5 years. The air went out of my lungs. Ruth introduced herself. She said my grandmother Nora had hired her 10 years earlier. 10 years, which meant my grandmother had set this in motion when I was 18 years old. Ruth had been hired on a retainer for a decade of periodic surveillance on my parents. Her instructions had been specific. She was to monitor the situation, document what she found, and make contact when the time was right. The time was right, Ruth said, when my mother had called the shelter pretending to be a social worker. That was the line Nora had drawn in her instructions. When they try to take away her shelter, you go find her. My grandmother had predicted this, almost to the year. I reached for the clasp on the briefcase. Inside, on top, was a cream-colored envelope with my name on it in Nora's cursive. The same handwriting she used on birthday cards, careful and slightly slanted, the writing of a woman who had grown up believing penmanship was a form of respect. Wren, if you're reading this, things have gotten bad. I'm sorry I couldn't stop your father while I was alive. I tried. I spent 30 years married to a man just like him, your grandfather, and I know how the walls close in, how they make you think the cage is normal. But I spent my last years making sure you wouldn't be trapped forever. Inside this case is your way out. Use it wisely. Don't use it for revenge. Use it for freedom. I love you more than he ever let me show. Grandma Nora. I set the letter down. My hands were steady. My eyes were not. Ruth waited. Then she opened a second compartment and removed a thick manila folder tabbed with colored dividers. 5 years of documentation, recordings of my mother's phone calls, 37 of them, each with a date stamp, a phone number, and a full transcription. In those calls, she identified herself variously as a concerned neighbor, a family friend, and on 2 occasions, a social worker. Copies of emails sent from an anonymous account traced through metadata to the Callaway household IP address, each containing an attachment formatted to mimic a police report. Photographs, taken through the kitchen window during Ruth's surveillance visits, of the blue notebook. My mother's list with its red check marks. I asked if it was admissible in court. Every bit of it, Ruth said. Ohio is a one-party consent state for recording. She was a licensed PI operating within the law. Her documentation followed chain of custody. Then she reached to the bottom of the briefcase and removed a large yellow envelope sealed with a plain wax stamp. In the upper left corner, the law office of a man named Philip Dern, Millfield, Ohio. I slid my finger under the flap. Inside, a stack of legal documents tabbed in blue. Ruth spoke while I read. My grandmother had sold the farm 10 years earlier for just under $300,000. She had placed the proceeds in a revocable trust, which became irrevocable upon her death. The funds had been managed conservatively. Certificates of deposit, treasury bonds, handled by a fiduciary at Dern's office, for the past 5 years. I looked at the summary page. Then I looked again. $340,000. The sole beneficiary, Wren Calloway. No other parties named. My father had no knowledge of the trust. Nora had been explicit on that point, and Dern had been instructed to have no contact with Roy or Sandra Calloway under any circumstances. Why didn't she give it to me before she died? I asked. Ruth said Nora had written a note to Dern on that question. The note said, "If I give it to her now, Roy will find a way to take it. She has to need it first." She had planned for everything, including the fact that I would be sitting in a shelter bed in month 7, holding a temporary ID I had spent 3 months fighting to obtain, needing it more than I had ever needed anything. The timing was exactly right. Philip Dern's office was above a hardware store in downtown Millfield. Narrow staircase, glass door with gold lettering, a waiting room with 2 chairs, and a fern that had clearly survived on neglect alone. Ruth drove me. I wore the only clean outfit I owned. Jeans, a white blouse borrowed from Linda, $4 thrift store shoes. Dern was 64, thin-frame glasses, silver hair. He stood when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his. He said my grandmother had talked about me constantly. He verified my temporary ID and my replacement birth certificate and cross-referenced my social security number through a secure system. Everything matched. Everything was in order. He slid the trust documents across the desk. I signed my name. My hand did not shake. Then he said something I had not anticipated. He told me Nora had left instructions for him that extended beyond the trust. She had written, "Wren might need a lawyer before she needs the money." He opened a desk drawer and produced a business card. Ellen Briggs, civil litigation, defamation, harassment based in Millfield. He said he had taken the liberty of calling her that morning. She could see me at 2. I looked at the card. I looked at Dern. Did my grandmother plan this too? She planned for the possibility, he said. She hoped it wouldn't come to this. I was in Ellen Briggs's office by 2:10. By 3:30, she had reviewed Ruth's entire evidence file. Every recording, every fabricated document, every red-checked entry in the blue notebook. Ellen was in her mid-40s, precise and direct in the way of someone who had spent years in rooms where imprecision cost people things. She said what my parents had done was defamation per se. In Ohio, falsely stating that someone has a criminal record is actionable without having to prove specific damages. But we had damages, 3 years of them, documented, recorded, time-stamped, and filed in chain of custody order by a licensed private investigator hired by my late grandmother a decade earlier. She filed the lawsuit that week. Roy Calloway was served on a Monday morning at 8:15. A process server walked up the driveway while he was checking the mailbox. The woman from the post office who lived 2 doors down was watering her azaleas. She watched the entire thing. The envelope, Roy's face, the way he stood in the driveway for a full minute reading the first page without moving. Sandra was served separately 1 hour later at the Harland Fresh Mart. She was in the cereal aisle. 3 women she knew from her cooking group were in the store at the time. By noon, half of Harland had heard. By dinner, the other half. Roy called my phone 14 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. Ellen had instructed me. All communication goes through counsel now. At 6:47 that evening, a text came through. "You're going to regret this. I'm your father." Ellen logged it. Exhibit 47. The following day, Sandra began her campaign. She called 5 neighbors in a single afternoon, crying to each one, delivering the same line. "My daughter is suing me because I loved her too much." It was the same logic my father had used at the kitchen table 3 years earlier. The language of protection deployed as a weapon, the language of love used to describe control. But something had shifted. The lawsuit had been filed in county court. Court records in Ohio are public. People in small towns read court records the way they read the church bulletin, thoroughly and with the specific interest of people who know everyone named in them. Within a week, someone at the diner had pulled up the complaint online. The summary was right there, in plain language: fabricated police reports, impersonation of a social worker, 37 documented calls to employers over a 3-year period. For the first time, people started asking Sandra questions she hadn't prepared for. Tom Adler, Roy's neighbor of 30 years, ran into her at the gas station. He asked, simply and directly, "Denise, is it true you called her employers?" She didn't answer. She got in her car and drove home. Roy signed up to speak at the next town council meeting. The podium had worked once. He had stood there months earlier, trembling lip, broken father, performing his heartbreak for 40 sympathetic faces while I sat in the back row and said nothing. He thought it would work again. This time the room was full. 60 people, maybe more, folding chairs pulled from storage, people standing along the back wall. This was not a meeting about potholes. I sat in the third row. Not the back. The third row. Ellen Briggs sat beside me with a legal pad and an expression that gave away nothing. Roy took the podium at 7:15 and said most of the town knew him. Said he had lived in Harland his whole life. Said his daughter was trying to destroy the family with a frivolous lawsuit, that she had been influenced by outsiders and lawyers who didn't know them. He looked at me while he spoke. I looked back. I did not flinch. Then Ellen stood up. She introduced herself, stated her bar number, and said simply that the complaint had been filed in county court, and its supporting evidence was part of the public record. She encouraged anyone curious to look it up rather than relying on one person's version of events. She sat down. No drama, no raised voice, no performance. The room was quiet for 8 full seconds. Then the council chair cleared his throat and moved to the next agenda item. Roy stood at the podium a moment longer. Then he sat down. He did not look at me again. The court granted a civil protection order 11 days later, 500 feet. No direct contact, no contact through third parties, no phone calls, texts, letters, emails, or messages relayed through neighbors or anyone else. Roy violated it within the first week. He borrowed his neighbor Dale's phone. Dale apparently didn't know any better, and sent me a message. "This isn't over, Caroline." Ellen documented it and filed it with the court. Roy received an official warning from the judge. One more violation, and he would face contempt charges. The defamation case moved forward. Ellen submitted Ruth's evidence package in full. The recordings, the call logs, the fabricated documents, the metadata linking the anonymous emails to the Calloway household. 37 calls across 3 years, 5 forged police reports, and 3 years of systematic interference with my ability to earn a living. Roy hired an attorney, a low-cost practitioner from 2 counties over who looked, Ellen told me later, like a man who would have preferred to be anywhere else. After reviewing the evidence package, he called Ellen and recommended settlement. Roy refused. "I will not settle with my own daughter." His attorney withdrew from the case the following week. Roy did not hire a replacement. Meanwhile, the court records were doing what public documents do in small towns. They spread. Dave, the restaurant manager in Granton who had canceled my interview after receiving the fake police report, called Ellen's office voluntarily. He still had the email with the forged attachment in his inbox. He had kept a note in the hiring file about the date and the nature of the document. He was willing to testify. Bill from the Millfield hardware store came forward too. He remembered the phone call. He remembered the voice. He had written a note in his hiring file the same day. I did not call these people. I did not contact anyone. I did not post anything online or go door to door telling my version. The evidence existed. The court records were accessible. And the people of Harland, for all their history of nodding along to whatever Roy Calloway said at town meetings, could read. The truth does not need a performance. It just needs to be accessible. Slowly, then all at once, Harland started reading. Sandra felt it first. The Thursday cooking circle, 8 women who had been meeting weekly for 15 years, sent a message through their organizer. "We think it's best if you take a break for now, Denise. Just until things settle down." Things were not going to settle down. Roy went to the coffee shop on Main Street, his booth, his 20-year morning ritual. The booth was occupied by no one in particular. People just weren't sitting there. He took a table by the window. No one joined him. The waitress refilled his coffee without making eye contact. Tom Adler came to the house. He stood on the porch and asked his neighbor of 30 years, Jerry, did you really fake a police report? Roy closed the door without a word. At the diner where I had bussed tables at 14, the cook mentioned to a regular that I had applied there once and been turned down because of a phone call. He said he felt sick about it. The regular told someone else, that someone told three others. The story moved through Harland the way all true stories move through small towns. Not as gossip exactly, but as a collective recalibration. People updating the picture they had been carrying, replacing one frame with another. What I noticed about this process, and I noticed it carefully because I had spent 3 years watching the reverse process happen, was that I had not caused any of it. I had not managed it. I had not called anyone or posted anything or gone door to door telling my side. I had simply allowed a legal proceeding to put the truth into a public record, and I had trusted that people who had access to accurate information would update their understanding accordingly. That trust was not naive. It was built on watching what happened when my father performed at the town council podium. The performance had worked once because nobody had anything to compare it to. When the public record gave them something to compare, the performance collapsed. A volunteer at the shelter named Barb, a retired teacher who had told me I should just go home because my daddy was heartbroken, came and found me in the lunch line. She had read the court filing. She said, I should have asked more questions before I said what I said. It was not an apology, exactly. It was a reckoning. Which was something. Roy represented himself in court after his attorney withdrew. A decision that turned out to be exactly as effective as it sounds. He filed one handwritten response. It said in its entirety, "This is a family matter, and the court has no jurisdiction over a father's right to protect his child." The judge disagreed. When Roy failed to appear for the scheduled hearing, Ellen moved for a default judgment. The court granted it. Defamation per se, tortious interference with prospective employment, economic damages, $85,000 calculated from 3 years of documented lost income and documented harm. Roy did not pay. Ellen filed a lien on the Calloway house. I was sitting in Philip Dern's office when the judgment came through. He printed it, handed it across the desk, and asked how I felt. Tired, I said. I meant it completely. That same week, Dern offered me a job. Not out of charity. He had watched me spend 2 months organizing Ruth's evidence files, building timelines, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies. He said he needed an administrative assistant and that I was the most organized person he had worked with in 40 years of practice. I started the following Monday, $16.50 an hour. Benefits after 60 days. A desk by the window with a fern that needed watering. I started watering it immediately because I had learned that things left untended tend to die slowly and without drama, and I had been that fern. I understood the assignment. With the trust funds, I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Millfield. Ground floor, small kitchen, a door with a lock and a key that belonged only to me. I bought a used Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. I opened a bank account with only my name on it. No secondary account holders, no joint access, no one who could drain it while I was sleeping. I bought a new toothbrush. I bought it at the regular price and put it in a bathroom drawer that nobody else had access to. And that sounds small, but it was not small. It was the first object I had owned in years that nobody could take. I bought groceries for the first time in my adult life without asking anyone's permission. I stood in the cereal aisle for 6 full minutes because I could stand there as long as I wanted and choose whatever I wanted, and nobody was going to say anything about it. The apartment was quiet. No one asked where I was going. No one checked my email. No one called my employer. The quiet was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. 3 months after the judgment, a letter arrived at the shelter. Linda forwarded it to my new address. Sandra had sent it to my old shelter address. A technical gray area in the protection order, but a violation of its spirit. I opened it at my kitchen table. My kitchen table. It said, "Dear Wren, I'm your mother. I'll always be your mother. Dad says he's sorry. Come have Thanksgiving dinner. We can put this behind us." I read it 3 times. Dad says he's sorry. Not Dad is sorry. Says, as if relaying a weather report. We can put this behind us, as if it were a disagreement about a thermostat. Not I was wrong. Not I shouldn't have called your employers 37 times. Not I fabricated official-looking documents to make you unemployable. Just, we can put this behind us. I made coffee. I fed my cat, a tabby I had adopted from the Millfield shelter and named Nora, because of course I did. Then I wrote back through Ellen as the protection order required. Mom, I wish you well, but love does not include sabotaging your child's ability to survive. You called my employers. You impersonated a social worker. You tried to get me removed from the only place I had to sleep. Please respect the court order. Do not contact me again. Wren. I sealed the envelope, stamped it, drove to the post office in Millfield. Then I went home. I cooked dinner for one. Pasta, garlic bread, a glass of water. Nora the cat sat on the counter and watched me eat. It was the best meal I had ever had. Roy sold the house. He had not had a choice. The lien Ellen had filed meant the judgment had to be satisfied before the property could transfer, and Roy couldn't pay $85,000 out of pocket. The house on Maple Street, the one I had grown up in, the one with the porch where he read his newspaper and pretended not to know what his wife was doing, sold for $168,000. After the lien, realtor fees, and back taxes he had been ignoring, he walked away with enough to rent. He and Sandra moved to a trailer park outside of Galion, 20 minutes from Harland. Close enough to still shop at the Fresh Mart. Far enough that people stopped running into them. Roy never admitted he was wrong. Not once. He told his new neighbors the same story he told the town council. My daughter was brainwashed by a lawyer. He will probably tell that story until the day he dies. Some people would rather lose everything than admit they were the villain. Sandra was different. Ruth mentioned it months later in one of our occasional phone calls. Sandra had started seeing a therapist on her own without Roy's knowledge. During the third session, she had said, I think I did something terrible. I don't know what to do with that. I am not ready to forgive her. I may never be. But I can hold two things at once. The woman who called 37 employers and lied about her daughter, and the woman who finally sat in a chair and said the truth out loud, even to just one person. Even just once. People are complicated, even the ones who hurt you most. Complicated does not mean you owe them access to your life. Healing does not require reconciliation. Sometimes it just requires distance and time and a cat that sheds on everything you own. I'm 28 years old. I work as an administrative assistant at a law office in Millfield. I am saving for community college. I have a one-bedroom apartment, a used Honda, and a cat named Nora who sheds on everything I own and has no opinions about any of it. I do not talk to my parents. I have not closed that door forever, but the key is mine now. They do not get to decide when it opens. I want to talk about my grandmother for a moment, because she is the part of this story that I keep returning to. Nora Calloway, a woman who sold a farm she had worked for 30 years and placed the entire proceeds into a trust for a granddaughter who did not yet know it existed. Who hired a private investigator and paid a decade-long retainer. Who wrote a letter, sealed it in a briefcase, labeled it with her granddaughter's name, and trusted that it would reach her when the time was right. She did all of this without telling me, without telling anyone except the attorney and the investigator. She did it knowing that if Roy found out, he would find a way to reach the money before I did. She did it knowing she would not be alive to see whether it worked. She did it 10 years before the worst of it happened, because she had known her son for 50 years, and she understood, in the quiet, prescient way of someone who has lived through the thing they are trying to prevent, exactly what he was capable of. That is what real love looks like. Not love as control. Not love as, I keep you small because I'm afraid of what you'll become without me. Real love looks at someone and asks, what does this person need to be free? And then it builds that thing, quietly, at significant personal cost. And it trusts the person to find it when they're ready. I think about the last thing she said to me at the gate of the farm. I sold the farm, but I didn't spend the money. Remember that? She said it knowing I wouldn't understand it. She said it anyway, planting it, trusting that I would find it in a shelter bed at 2 in the morning when the roof was leaking and I finally needed to remember. I think about all the versions of me who could have given up before that morning. The version who got in the car and drove back to Maple Street after the first canceled interview. The version who stopped applying after the third. The version who stayed in that shelter and let the walls my parents were building around it close in completely. Every single one of those versions would have been understandable. Every single one of them would have been reasonable. It is not weakness to run out of hope when people are actively taking it from you. It is the most natural thing in the world. The version of me that survived did so because a woman in her 70s had looked 50 years down her bloodline, seen exactly what was coming, and built a door out before the walls went up. Somewhere right now, someone is lying in a bed they don't own, staring at a ceiling they can't paint, wondering whether wanting a life of their own makes them a bad daughter or a bad son. Whether wanting independence is betrayal. Whether wanting to work, to build something, to leave, whether that is selfish and ungrateful and disloyal. It is not. Wanting to work is not betrayal. Wanting independence is not disrespect. Walking away from people who are actively dismantling your ability to survive is not cruelty. It is survival. And survival, when everything has been taken from you and you are still choosing it, is one of the bravest things a person can do. My parents did not keep me close because they loved me. They kept me close because my dependence served them. There is a version of what they did that can be called love if you are willing to squint at it from a very particular angle. It was not love. It was investment management. I was an asset that produced returns in the form of labor and compliance, and they were protecting their portfolio. My grandmother was the only person in my family who loved me without attaching conditions to it. She was not able to save herself. She spent years in a marriage that controlled everything about her. But she got free eventually, and when she did, the first thing she did with that freedom was use it to build mine. She sat on a porch with sweet tea and looked out at the field she had worked for 30 years, the field she had just sold, and thought about what would happen to her granddaughter after she was gone. And she made a plan. She did not tell me about the plan. She could not, because if Roy had known about the trust, he would have found a way to reach it. He was good at that. He had spent 19 years as a plant manager and decades before that learning from a father who was exactly the same kind of man. Careful, patient, systematic, always working from a position of information advantage. My grandmother knew her son. She had known him for 50 years. She understood that the only way to protect me was to work completely out of his sight. So she hired an investigator he did not know about. She funded a trust he was never told existed. She wrote a letter she sealed in a briefcase she labeled with my name. And she planted one sentence at the gate of a farm on an ordinary afternoon. I sold the farm, but I didn't spend the money, remember that. And she trusted that the sentence would find me when I needed it. It found me on bed 14 in a converted warehouse on Mill Street at 2 in the morning, while a roof was leaking over bed 12, and I was trying to remember why I was still fighting. That is what love that does not need recognition looks like. It does not announce itself. It does not require gratitude. It works in the dark over years and trusts that the person it is working for will find it eventually and know what to do with it. She wrote in her letter, "Freedom isn't free, but you're worth every penny." I think about that line more than any other. Not because of the money, though the money was what made the lawsuit possible, what made the apartment and the Honda and the cat named Nora possible. I think about it because of what it says about how she saw me. She looked at the full cost and decided I was worth it. After years of being in a house where my worth was measured in what I could produce and relinquish, one woman had looked at me and decided I was worth her entire farm. I look at the photograph of her that I packed in the backpack the night I left, alongside the toothbrush and the phone charger and the $12. The photograph is on my windowsill now, in the apartment in Millfield, next to the fern I have been keeping alive since Dern first pointed me to the desk by the window. I water it every Monday. It is doing well. She is smiling in the photograph. She always smiled with her whole face, the way people smile when they are not performing it, when it just arrives because they mean it. I look like her a little, around the eyes. I did not know that until I was old enough to look at photographs of her the way you look at photographs of people you are still becoming. I am 28 years old. I am going to be 38. I am going to be 48 and 58. And I am going to be in rooms that are mine, at tables that are mine, with coffee I made myself in a kitchen nobody else scheduled me to be in. None of those versions of me will be standing at a sink at midnight scrubbing a cast iron skillet and wondering if this is all there is. I know who built the door. I know what it cost. And every morning when I unlock my apartment and feed my cat and drive my own car to work in my own life, I am honoring the woman who planned it 10 years before I needed it, in the only way I know how to honor anyone, by using what they gave me and being exactly who they believed I could be. Use it for freedom, she wrote, not revenge. I did. And if this story found you at the right moment, if you have been lying in a bed you don't own, wondering whether wanting a life makes you ungrateful or disloyal or wrong, I have another one waiting for you right now. A woman who gave everything she had, for years, to people who took credit for all of it, until the day she stopped and they discovered what they had actually been living on. The link is on your screen right now. I'll see you there.